Good evening, everyone, and thank you, those of you who had to brave the weather to join us. That's really very strong-willed of you. But it's nice to be here this evening, and this is an important topic. So my remarks are going to be on the general level because you have experts, so I'm not going to go through the detail of what they have found out in terms of this project. But obviously, just in terms of media and the importance of it, it's almost crazy to have to say how important it is in a society, but it is, because everything we do, everyone does, it needs to be reflected in our media and needs to be covered by and commented on. And citizens rely on the media to give them information, to give them opinions, analysis, photographs, whatever it is, but media is crucial to a democracy, to a vibrant democracy. But clearly we don't want just one view. It's really important in society to have reflected the many different views of citizens across the media landscape. And I suppose I hadn't really given a huge amount of thought to the threats that exist to that, that we hold dear. But of course there are many different threats, and there's huge changes in the media, both in ownership, but in terms of what we now regard as mainstream media. If you ask any teenager or young adult, I mean, mainstream media for them is what's on the iPhone, whereas if you ask an older person, mainstream is the broadsheet that they buy, perhaps still every day. So the media landscape is changing. The way people access information is dramatically changing. In many respects, citizens themselves are becoming journalists and are feeding into media stories and opinion and shaping views in society. So it's a very different world. My last engagement as a journalist was in early 2004, and my first engagement was in 1980. And even since I left journalism, the changes have been quite dramatic. Dramatic insofar as the different platforms that are now available for news and information and features and sharing of data. But equally dramatic, and I think this needs perhaps to be reflected in some of your deliberations today, is the demands on journalists. Because as I would view it, there are much more demands on the individual journalist today than in the past. So a print journalist is also a blogger, is also a video producer, puts information on Twitter, perhaps on Snapchat. So the amount of demands on journalists is quite high and different than in the past. Equally, the issue of the economic viability of media outlets is also in question because of the changing media landscape, which also feeds into the rewards that journalists might get, whether they're appropriate for the work they do. And I think that's something that if we want a free and open press, and if we want particularly investigative journalism, there is a price to be paid for it, and we have to look at whether we are doing that at the moment and how the changes in the media landscape might be impacting on that, because that does affect then the functioning of democracies. So this project, Media Pluralism Monitoring, is very important, because what it will do is avoid us basing policy on what we think. And we all have opinions, whether they're well-formed or not. This gives us information that has been gathered scientifically from member states and analyses it, and then allows us to reflect on those findings and take some action if we feel that's appropriate. But at the very least, it gives us good quality information. So I think that's the key part of why the Parliament is interested and involved in this project, because it will give us that level of information that we need as policymakers. And I think citizens themselves will want to understand what's happening in their own member states. So I imagine that each of the countries that are analysed, there will be careful scrutiny of that analysis in each of the countries by both the media and indeed by citizens as well. So I think that's a really core part of why I'm very happy to be here and to endorse and hear hopefully some of the presentations that will be made. Pluralism is important, because if we only have one view coming across, it's detrimental to a functioning society. And we have to look very clearly at the threats to that media pluralism and how we might impact in our work here to make things better, but at least to be aware of the challenges that are there. In terms of the project itself, as you know, the Parliament has been particularly involved in this, and we have moved, I think, from analysing 9 countries initially in 2014, then 19 in 2015, and we're going to get the results of those delivered to us very shortly. Just some last remarks in terms of the general landscape. I have often made the remark that never before have we had so much information and the possibilities to access information, but perhaps what we all lack is the time to carefully decipher information and make judgment calls about, what's useful and what's not useful. So I think there's a challenge maybe in terms of our education systems to allow young people to be able to distill information. I know, for example, we get very concerned where people are becoming their own GP, making medical diagnosis because they can access information online. And yes, I'm guilty, so we've all done that. So there is a challenge to our media systems to try and educate. We're too late to be educated because we've learned by doing, and probably, like driving the car, learned all the wrong ways. But I do think we are going to have to look at ways of how we talk to children about this access to information, and that every story isn't of the same weight or value as others, and to be always open to questioning what's behind headlines and then look for further sources of information. And I think that is a crucial aspect of this discussion. And I know I've had conversations with many school leaders and principals who are worried about social media in the schoolroom, the impact it can have, both the positive impacts and then some of the very negative consequences, how children and young adults deal with some of the issues that might arise online. But I suppose today what we're doing is looking at the very real risks that exist to media pluralism, particularly in some places, the opportunities for more media pluralism, and indeed the best part of this is that we can look at best practice. And I think one thing that the European Union tries to do across all our range of policy areas is look at best practice and see can we implement it in other places. And I think there will be a welcome in media organisations for this. I had a very interesting exchange just last week with some of the traditional media outlets in one member state who are looking at digital and other options. And I certainly got a message very clearly that their future is very uncertain, and that many of the issues, including VAT and other policy areas, are impacting negatively on them at the moment. And they are looking towards the Parliament and to the EU generally to get more involved in the media landscape so that we can perhaps make changes for the better. Because the one thing we don't want to see is a concentration of editorial lines. We want variety. We want to be challenged as readers, and we want to make sure that there's sufficient range of journalistic activities out there so that we are challenged. So I think today's event is a real opportunity, and I very much welcome the Library Service engagement with this, for us to learn more, as I say, the science behind perhaps some of our opinions, which rather may well be flawed. But I think the fact that we have this pilot project will give us that science and direct us in ways where we can address and ensure that we have that much valued media pluralism. Thank you for your attention.